Have you ever been underestimated because of your appearance? They laughed at you, treated you like an outsider, thinking you'd never stand up for yourself. But little did they know, with just one moment, everything would change, and the entire school would fall silent in awe. This is not just a story about a new student being bullied. It's a story of perseverance, of how one can rise against injustice without needing to use fists, but with intelligence, courage, and a perfect strategy. Do you believe that sometimes silence can be the most powerful weapon? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to prove yourself to those who misjudged you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe that justice and self-respect are more important than anything, hit like to support this message, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next inspiring stories. George walked into Redmond High School with a feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't anxiety, it wasn't fear, but it wasn't exactly confidence either. It was the feeling of someone who knew they wouldn't be welcomed. This school was so different from where he had come from. The large, shiny hallways, the lockers neatly arranged like an unspoken rule of order. But what caught his attention the most wasn't the facilities, but the gazes of those around him. He didn't need anyone to say it. He knew they were looking at him. It wasn't the friendly gaze of people ready to make friends, but the scrutinizing one, curiosity mixed with judgment. Whispers, suppressed giggles when he walked by. George didn't care. He was used to being an outsider. Then he saw Paul. Leaning against the lockers, Paul was the kind of guy everyone knew. Tall, confident, with the presence of someone who was used to controlling everything around them. He didn't say anything right away, but the way he looked at George, the slight smirk, was enough for George to understand. Paul didn't need to be explicit. The message was clear. You don't belong here. George had lived long enough to know that people like Paul didn't like being ignored, but he wasn't the type of person who would kneel before anyone. He walked on, pretending not to notice Paul's gaze, as if he didn't care. But deep down, he knew this encounter was just the beginning. In the following days, everything became clearer. Paul wasn't just an ordinary bully. He was smart, strategic, and knew how to play the power game. The accidental bumps in the hallway, the sarcastic comments, the cruel jokes, all were executed with such finesse that it was hard for teachers to catch him. Paul didn't need to use his fists to assert power. He just needed to make everyone laugh, so they'd side with him on how he treated George. George didn't react, at least not at first. He remembered his father's words. Strength isn't for proving, it's for controlling. He tried to control himself, to avoid falling into Paul's game. But as time passed, the provocations only grew more intense. The tipping point came on Friday at lunch. Paul and his crew showed up, that unmistakable smirk on his face. His words echoed across the cafeteria, loud enough for everyone to hear. A simple sentence, but it was enough to make George the target of ridicule. Then came the actions. A swipe of his hand sent George's lunch tray tumbling to the floor, an apple thrown like it was just a joke. Laughter erupted, eyes watching, everyone expecting a reaction from George. But they didn't get what they wanted. George didn't get angry. He didn't lose his cool. He simply stood up slowly and looked Paul directly in the eye. A gaze unwavering, a moment that felt like a century. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. Silence took over the cafeteria. The people who had been laughing moments ago were now holding their breath, because they had just witnessed something no one expected. And from that moment on, George was no longer an outsider. He was someone the entire school would never forget. George walked into the cafeteria at lunchtime with the familiar feeling of being watched. Eyes skimmed over him. Conversations faltered briefly before quickly resuming. They knew They were waiting to see what would happen next. Paul knew too. He sat at his usual table with his group of friends, that smug smile never leaving his face, even though the silence in the cafeteria was heavier than usual. Paul wasn't the type to let a small defeat damage his reputation. He had been beaten last Friday, but today was a new day, a new game. George knew that. But what he didn't know was that today, George was the one setting the rules. He sat down at his table, picking up his food tray like he usually did. Nothing special, nothing forced, but the silence in the cafeteria spoke volumes. Paul wanted to reclaim his honor, and he wouldn't wait long. "Well, Mercer," Paul's voice called out from the other side of the room, not too loud, but enough for those around him to hear. "I hear you're pretty good at putting on a show for the crowd." Snickers erupted, but not from everyone. Some students sat quietly, their eyes no longer gleaming with amusement. What they had witnessed last week still lingered in their minds. George didn't look up. He picked up a piece of bread, took a bite, and chewed slowly. His calmness made Paul frown. It wasn't the reaction he was expecting. Paul stood up. "Nothing to say?" George put the bread down, finally looking up. His gaze wasn't filled with anger, wasn't taunting, but there was no fear in it either. "Are you sure you want to continue?" George's voice was calm enough to make Paul hesitate for a moment. Paul clenched his jaw. He knew he was making a mistake, but he couldn't back down, not after starting something in front of everyone. "If you think I'm scared of you just because of one lucky shot—" "No," George interrupted. "I don't think you're scared. I just think you haven't learned your lesson yet." Paul gritted his teeth. The cafeteria was so silent you could hear the sound of a fork scraping a tray from across the room. His fists clenched, but he didn't take another step. Both of them knew. This time, if Paul made the first move, he would lose. George didn't need to do anything. He didn't need to prove he was stronger. He had already done that. And when Paul turned away, the whispers began. But this time, they weren't aimed at George. He looked down at his tray and continued his meal, because at that moment, he knew he had done something not everyone could do. He had won without fighting. George sat on the back steps of the school, his breath steady, but a strange feeling bubbled up inside him. A light breeze carried the sound of the bell signaling the start of the next class, but he didn't rush to return. He knew that everything was more than just a confrontation with Paul. It was something bigger, a battle he hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. Ava walked up to him, not needing to ask if he was okay, because she knew George would only respond silently. She sat down beside him and handed him a bottle of water. "You're not avoiding today," she said, her voice a mix of encouragement and concern. George gave a small smile and shook his head. "I never planned on running away." Ava sat in silence for a moment. She had seen what happened in the cafeteria. She had also noticed how people started looking at George differently, no longer with curiosity or judgment, but with respect, even admiration. But Ava understood that didn't mean this fight was over. "You know," George spoke suddenly, "when I was younger, my dad always said that sometimes silence is stronger than words. I didn't understand that until I saw Paul's face today." Ava nodded. She had seen it too. Paul wasn't just angry, he was confused. He had expected a direct confrontation, a battle he could control. But George had refused to play Paul's game, and that had thrown Paul off balance. "Do you think this will stop here?" Ava asked. George gazed into the distance. He knew a person like Paul wouldn't give up easily. He'd find another way to retaliate, maybe not immediately, but it would come. But this time, George was prepared. He stood up and looked Ava straight in the eye, his gaze filled with a quiet determination not everyone could possess. I don't care what happens next, he said. I just know I won't back down. Ava smiled gently, then stood up with him. Then I won't let you face it alone. Together, they walked back to the school building, leaving behind the old steps and unnecessary worries. Because in that moment, they weren't just two friends. They were two people who understood that life wasn't just about battles, but about how you choose to face them. The light rain fell on the schoolyard, with tiny droplets shattering on the asphalt. George stood leaning against the railing in the hallway, his gaze deep in thought as he watched the water settle on his hand. Tomorrow was the hearing. Tomorrow he would have to face those who were trying to push him out of the school. Ava stood beside him, saying nothing, but George knew she was worried. Since everything began, she had always been there, his only friend who trusted him when the whole school was looking at him with suspicion or curiosity. "Are you scared?" she asked, her voice so quiet it was almost drowned by the rain. George didn't answer immediately. He thought about everything that had happened. He wasn't the one who started this fight, but he had been dragged into it. Paul couldn't accept losing face in front of everyone, and now he was using his family's connections to push George out of the school as revenge. Scared? George gave a faint smile. "I don't think this is the first time I've been put in a bad situation, but one thing I know for sure." He turned to look at Ava, his gaze more determined than ever. "I won't let them push me out that easily." Ava nodded slightly, probably knowing the answer before she even asked. The next day, the school meeting room was packed. The principal sat in the center with Paul's father, an arrogant, powerful man, sitting beside him. He looked at George like he was just a kid who didn't know his place. Paul sat there, not looking at him, but George could see the triumphant smile hidden behind his calm demeanor. "We have a witness who says Mercer attacked my son for no reason," Paul's father said, his voice firm. Before George could respond, Ava stood up. "Who is your witness?" she asked. The room fell silent. Paul's father blinked, clearly not expecting anyone to interrupt him. "That's not important." George smiled. "So, what if I have evidence showing I didn't attack Paul?" He pulled out his phone, showing a video that was recorded in the cafeteria. The video clearly showed Paul as the aggressor, and it was Paul who was subdued by George's defensive move. The principal reviewed the footage, then nodded. "With this evidence, there's no reason to discipline Mercer." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Paul froze, and his father clenched his jaw. For the first time, George saw the shock on their faces. As they walked out of the meeting room, Ava smiled faintly. "You just took them down without lifting a finger." George sighed, but felt a sense of relief. Sometimes fighting doesn't mean throwing punches. Sometimes it just means not letting anyone else decide your fate. They walked outside. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a fresh atmosphere and a new glimmer of hope. The Redmond High cafeteria was filled with laughter, the clatter of plastic trays against tables, and casual chatter about the upcoming football game. But in a quiet corner, George sat in silence, trying to focus on his lunch. He knew every eye was on him. Paul, the one who had once mocked him, was now avoiding him. But George wasn't smug. He knew the storm wasn't truly over. Ava set her tray down across from him. "Listen, I know you won a round, but do you think it's over?" she asked. George looked up, his gaze calm, without the worry Ava had expected. "Not yet," he replied, his voice low but certain. And he was right. Less than 2 days later, Paul's father, a member of the school board, filed a formal complaint against George. They accused him of bullying, calling him a danger who needed to be expelled. That night, as George sat in his room, his phone buzzed. A message from Ava. "You have to fight. Don't let them decide your fate. George stared at the screen, a deep sense of regret rising within him. He never wanted this to turn into a battle, but if he didn't stand up, who would do it for him? The school board meeting came faster than expected. The room was packed with familiar faces, teachers, students, and even curious parents. At the front, Paul's father sat with a posture of power, his cold eyes fixed on George as if he was certain of his victory. The principal cleared his throat, ready to announce his decision. But before he could speak, the door opened. Ava walked in, followed by two other students, each carrying a stack of papers. "I object," she said, her voice clear and firm. Paul's father frowned. "You don't have the right." Ava raised her phone. "I have evidence." On the screen were a series of texts and emails between Paul and his friends, where they had plotted to frame George and get him expelled. The room fell into a stunned silence. George looked at Ava, a mix of surprise and gratitude flooding his chest. She hadn't let him fight alone. The board chairperson took a deep breath before declaring, "There is no reason to suspend George Mercer. Furthermore, we will open an investigation into Paul Callow's actions." Shock, suspense, a glimmer of hope. As everyone left the meeting room, George turned to Ava. "Thank you." She shrugged, smiling. "You're not alone." And for the first time in many days, George felt like he truly wasn't alone anymore. George walked out of the school building, his breath slow but heavy. The feeling of victory from the school board meeting hadn't quite settled, but something deep inside him whispered, this wasn't over. Paul might have lost, but people like him don't give up easily. Ava walked beside him, a light smile on her face. "You okay?" George nodded, but deep down, he knew this was only temporary. "I'm fine, but do you think they'll leave me alone?" Ava didn't answer right away. She just quietly observed him, then said, "No, but you're not alone anymore." Her words made George's chest warm. There was a connection there he'd never felt before, but the very next day, the fragile peace was shattered. George's phone buzzed in class, an anonymous message. "You may have escaped this time, but you won't escape forever. Be careful." He gripped the phone tightly, his heart racing. Who sent this? Paul, his friends, or someone even more dangerous? Before he could think any further, Ava noticed the change in his expression. She leaned over, glancing at the screen. "You need to report this to someone." George shook his head. "No, I don't want to make this into a bigger issue." "George," Ava said seriously, looking at him, "you've tried to let it go before. Did it help?" He was silent. No, it didn't help at all. That afternoon, George decided to do something he'd never considered before. He walked straight into the principal's office, placed his phone on the desk, and said, "I want to report a threat." The principal stared at him for a long moment. "Do you know who sent it?" George shook his head. "But I know this won't stop unless someone does something." What George didn't expect was how quickly things would unfold. Within a day, an internal investigation was launched. The school system discovered that George wasn't the only one targeted. There were other students who had silently endured out of fear. The truth came to light, and with it came unavoidable consequences. Paul was given a long-term suspension. Some of his friends were also disciplined. But more importantly, for the first time, George felt like he had done the right thing. The next day, Ava sat next to him in the cafeteria, looking at him like she was evaluating something. "You've changed," she said. George laughed. "No, I just finally realized that I don't have to fight alone anymore." She tilted her head, smiling. "And that makes you stronger." This time, George didn't deny it. He knew he had crossed into a new territory, a place where he wasn't the one who suffered, but the one standing up to protect himself and others. George sat on the stone bench in the school courtyard, the brilliant sunset painting the sky with a vibrant orange hue. He never thought he'd have this moment, a peaceful moment after everything that had happened. He remembered the feeling of walking out of the principal's office when the news about Paul's suspension spread throughout the school. It wasn't a feeling of victory, but one of relief. Finally, it was all over, but had it truly ended? Ava appeared beside him, sitting down with a can of soda in her hand. "Do you think it's really over?" George shook his head. "I don't know. Part of me wants to believe he'll let it go, but another part?" He sighed, his eyes distant. "I know people like Paul. They don't give up easily." Ava looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "But you're not the George he used to bully anymore." He turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" She smiled lightly, shaking her head. "At the beginning of the year, you were the guy trying to avoid trouble, trying to stay quiet to not draw attention. But now, you've stood up, not just for yourself, but for others too." He was silent. Ava's words made him remember the important moments, the times he faced Paul, when he decided not to bow his head, when he walked into the principal's office to report what had happened. He never thought he'd have the courage to do those things. "You've changed, George," Ava continued, her voice gentle but firm. "And I think that's made you stronger." He smiled faintly. "You know, I never thought I'd have anyone standing by my side." Ava raised an eyebrow. "Don't you see? You've never really been alone. Me, others, even the teachers. Everyone saw what was going on. You just had to speak up first." George felt something warm in his chest, not just relief, but a real sense of hope, something stronger than the fear he'd once had. He looked at Ava, and for the first time in a long time, he felt okay. "So, what are you going to do now?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. George looked up at the sky, letting the cool breeze touch his skin. "I think it's time to help others." Ava smiled, a real smile, not just a polite one, but one of connection, of something bigger than just the two of them. And in that moment, George knew that he hadn't just changed himself, he had found a purpose. As George walked out of the principal's office, all eyes were still on him. Some were surprised, others whispered, and a few, those who hadn't paid attention before, now watched him with a different gaze. No longer the bullied, no longer the one who silently endured. He had changed. Paul was suspended for a week. It was a small victory, but it wasn't what George cared most about. What mattered more was that he had stood up, that he had dared to face the injustice. But was that enough? He slowly walked out to the schoolyard, where the autumn breeze blew through the trees, carrying golden leaves that gently fell to the ground. That was when Ava walked up beside him. "Are you okay?" Her voice was gentle but full of concern. George let out a long breath, then smiled faintly. "Yeah, I think so, but I'm not sure it's really over yet." Ava nodded, then sat on the nearby bench, patting the seat next to her. George sat down, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "You know," Ava spoke up, her voice thoughtful, "you're not the first person Paul has tried to bully, but you're the first one who stood up to him this way." George turned to look at her, his gaze full of curiosity. "What do you mean?" "There have been many others who were victims of Paul before," she continued, "but they either stayed silent or fought back in ways that caused them even more harm. You're different. You used your patience, your intelligence, and your courage to make everyone see the truth." He was silent for a moment, then smiled softly. "I'm not sure I've done that much." Ava chuckled lightly and shook her head. "You don't realize it, George. You've changed how people see you, and maybe you've even changed how they see themselves." He looked down at his hands, realizing they were no longer clenched into fists like before. "I don't want to stop here," he said, his voice more determined. "I want to help others, the ones who were once like me." Ava tilted her head, her eyes sparkling. "So, what are you going to do next?" George looked out over the schoolyard, where other students were chatting and laughing, living their carefree lives. He knew that, perhaps among them, someone was struggling with their own fears. He turned to Ava, a confident smile forming on his lips. "I think I'll start by listening." In the days following the revelation, everything at Redmond High seemed to change. It wasn't a loud change, but more of a subtle shift. A way students began talking about what had happened, how some of them walked with a more cautious gaze, and how those who had once mocked him now fell silent when they saw him walk by. But George didn't care about becoming the center of attention. What mattered to him was what would happen next. One late afternoon, as the hallways started to empty, George heard a quiet voice behind him. "George." He turned around. It was Ethan, a freshman he only knew in passing. The boy stood hesitantly, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a flicker of hope. "What's up?" George asked, keeping his voice calm. Ethan bit his lip, then took a deep breath. How do you stand up to them?" George looked at him. The question wasn't just curiosity, it was a cry for help. Something in Ethan's eyes told him that the boy had been through something similar. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured for Ethan to sit down on the nearby stairs. The boy slowly complied, his hands nervously clasped together. "No one is born strong," George began, his voice low and sincere. "I used to think that if I stayed silent, if I just kept walking without responding, everything would eventually disappear. But I was wrong." Ethan swallowed hard. "But if I speak out, they'll just make it worse." George nodded. "I thought that too. And sometimes it really can happen. But when you stay silent, they win. When you stand up, even just once, you take back a part of the power they tried to take from you." Ethan was silent for a long time. Then the boy looked up, his eyes a little brighter. "Do you think I can do it?" George smiled gently. "It's not about whether you can, it's that you deserve to." In that moment, George realized that his fight had never been just for himself. It was about people like Ethan, those who had no one standing up for them. And if he could do something, even just a little, to change that, then it was reason enough to keep going. Ethan smiled faintly, but there was something in his eyes that had changed. "I'll try," he said softly. George nodded. "And when you need someone to stand by you, I'll be here." George's story wasn't just about a confrontation in a school hallway. It was a powerful reminder of the value of courage, perseverance, and the strength of truth. Sometimes injustice doesn't come from grand gestures, but from the little things, the mocking words, the contemptuous looks, or actions that seem harmless at first. But silence in the face of these things doesn't make them disappear. It only gives more power to those who abuse it. George chose not to remain silent. He didn't choose to fight with his fists, didn't respond with hatred, but instead with intelligence, confidence, and self-awareness. He not only protected himself, but paved the way for others like Ethan, those who didn't yet know how to stand up for themselves. The greatest lesson from this story is, never let anyone else define your worth. Society might divide people into different groups, strong and weak, but in the end, only you can determine your own value. You don't have to prove it to bullies, prove it to yourself, that you deserve respect. And more importantly, sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't just change your life, it inspires others to do the same. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.